my colleagues and panelists. So, Sarah, do you want to say about 30 seconds on yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm Sarah Naylor. I'm a steering committee member at the Crisis Communications Network, CIPR's committee, and I have a background in strategic communications, specialising in crisis communications, and also years ago was a newspaper journalist, national news, so seen my fair share of crises from the other end of the pen, as it were. I am delighted that you're all joining us today. I think this network is really excellent, and I'm looking forward to moderating the questions later on. So please do put your questions in the chat, and I'll be dipping into there later on when there's an opportunity to bring forward some of the thoughts that emerge as we listen to our panelists. Thank you.
Brilliant, Sarah. Thank you. Charlie, a bit about yourself.
So, Charlie McLean, Bristol. I'm a sort of business continuity, crisis management, cyber incident management person by trade. My own background is Army, followed by emergency planning and handling water, followed by Scottish Power, business continuity. And then I formed Plan B Consulting 17 years ago. So we exist in the business continuity, crisis management, cyber incident management space.
Sorry?
Brilliant. Thank you. Elle-Marie, tell us about yourself and Go Crisis.
Hi, Rod. Thanks for having me here. I'm the CEO of Go Crisis, and our company effectively provides readiness services for our clients to get ready for responses and incidents and crises around the world. Then we provide the tactical boots on the ground response on how they will deliver what they need to do to take care of the affected people, and then the recovery side of things. And I won't delve into too much detail because I know we'll touch more on that a little bit later. But yes, we help organizations around the world respond to incidents affecting their brand, their staff, and their customers.
Superb. And last but not least, Rena.
Hi, Rena Singh. I'm a resilience practitioner by day, as Rod mentioned. I have international experiences in an array of industries, so all around there. When I'm not doing that, I run and host the Resilience Pod podcast, which is a podcast dedicated to helping you all become resilient. It's international. And also, I am the chair of the Business Continuity Institute's Women in Resilience Network, which gives women a huge platform who work in resilience to showcase their thought leadership. Thank you.
Superb. Thank you. Thank you very much. So just very briefly, before I go to each of the panelists for an initial sort of 5-minute view from the floor, for those of you who don't know, and hopefully most of you do since you've signed up, the CIPR Crisis Communications Network was set up about 2 years ago, essentially to help the CIPR community share and learn from best practice and emerging best practice in the issues management and crisis communication space. So we have a regular series of events of which this is one. We have a blog, a newsletter, and all sorts of other things to help you keep up to date with, dare I say it, the cutting edge of issues and crisis. And today's topic was informed by, essentially a core insight is that any of us who have ever done issues management or crisis comms knows that the term PR crisis should in fact be banned from the lexicon, because in reality, PR crises invariably stem not from the comms function, but from a combination of other factors. Those can include operational, structural, or leadership consideration. Governance often comes into play, decision-making, and fundamentally culture. And so it's quite strange that all too often the communications function is shuffled off into a corner and asked to come up with an approach to issues management, crisis communication in splendid isolation from all the other business functions that are fundamental to reputational and relational risk and resilience, be it legal, marketing, HR, operations, strategy, or risk. So what we wanted to do today was to tackle head on that conundrum of PR being asked to make an organization reputationally resilient when it is not only the PR function that drives reputational resilience. So that is essentially what we're looking at today. how you build resilience by being truly integrated in the way you approach crisis preparedness. So that's essentially what we're covering. If I may, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give us, 4, 5, 6 minutes of their take and experience on what I've just discussed through the lens of their day job. So Elle-Marie, if I could ask you to go first. I mean, obviously you've built a pretty remarkable and truly global business. And it's always struck me, the really tight integration of these complementary areas of expertise is at the core. So can you give us an overview of the extent to which, in your experience, resilience is, if you like, integration dependent, and maybe touch on the role that communication plays in areas such as family assistance and critical incident management. So tell us your thoughts.
Sure, Rod. It's one of those things that I feel like I don't know where to start because it can become a can of worms, but I'm going to narrow it down a little bit. So I will talk firstly about the importance of preparedness, but I feel like I'm preaching to an audience of converted people here, but I will touch on that. And then how the response relies so heavily on communications and the other way around, the tactical response. So first, just a little bit more background, just to give you an idea of where I come from with my perspective. So my career started many years ago in the aviation industry. And I studied communications, a business degree, but with communications as a major. So I'm definitely one who understands the importance of communicating. I then did a project here in the UK over my career. That's how it started, is how London businesses would prepare, respond, and then recover from a terrorist attack or a natural disaster. Those were the two big risks that we were looking at London businesses. And it was mostly tourist businesses that were really concerned about how they will respond and then recover. I then got more into real frontline response. So I worked for a large disaster management company that was also global, and I became a director for them. And in my time with them, I have done the Helios aviation disaster, Africa. I've done COVID-19 response more recently. We have done Hurricane Katrina, the Asian tsunami. I can carry on with the unfortunate events that I've been privileged to be involved in. So where we come from, myself and also the organization, is from that real frontline experience. And what I've learned there is two real big lessons. The one is that it is not what has happened that people necessarily blame you for as an organization, but it is how you respond to that. And the other thing is how important communications, because it doesn't matter how well you respond. And Rod, you and I know well how MH17 and MH370, the different responses, which MH370, we know that the company did so much, but their hands were tied when it comes to communications. So you can do the best job on the ground for the affected people, but if you don't say what you do, or if you don't do what you say, then there's a disconnect in the perception of the world in how you as an organization is responding. So what we have learned is that there is a few key things, and I will use an aviation disaster as an example, but we do respond to data breaches. We've responded to product recalls. So it could be a loss of life, loss of reputation, loss of infrastructure, anywhere where the organization needs a surge capacity of resources to deal with it outside of their business as usual. So we try to ring fence the incident away from the organization's business as usual. It doesn't mean we take it over. We just help organizations bring in additional trained resources to deal with that. So the key things that we provide is firstly crisis communications support, and Rod is part of that team that supports us with that. So that is supporting the readiness, the FAQs, the spokespeople training, the key messaging, all of that. But under that communications is also communicating also with the stakeholders, which could be the community that is affected by the disaster, your staff, and of course, more importantly, those who've been directly affected by this incident. The second service that we provide is family assistance, and that is if there's been fatalities, to look after the families of those who have lost their lives. So everything that they need, we fly them into the site, we make sure that they know where the briefings are happening, when the briefings are happening, by which agencies, we arrange all their travel, there's meet and greet, people who have been trained by psychological first aid to meet them, we provide mental health support, all the practical support that they need on the ground, from childcare to the logistics of going to the site or attending memorial services. So really an end-to-end service to the affected people. Then we provide the search and recovery of human remains and the repatriation of those, the search and recovery of personal effects and the repatriation of those, because that's such a big part of your humanitarian response. What another service that we provide is the injured survivor support. So if a company has people who have been injured and they've gone to different hospitals, we try and make sure we find out where they've gone, get consent to be able to provide that information back to the families. And there's a lot of there's a big cog behind taking care of affected people, whether it is a data breach or major loss of life. And what we have learned is we've based our services around what I've learned. I'm also an incident commander for the Red Cross. And what I've learned there is that the people closest to the site who can get to the affected people, communicate clearly, take care of those who've been touched by this incident, they make the biggest difference. So we've based our response capacity around that, our tactical response. So what we've learned is if you are in the country close to where the incident has happened, and you can get there quickly, you understand the culture, the language, you don't have to worry about visas, that really makes a difference. But then, of course, it means nothing if it is not backed up with your comms. And the biggest problem that we have found is the speed in which things are happening with comms teams, is that the comms guys know what is needed. They know, they have got an instinct for this. The tactical guys know what needs to be done, but it's often bogged down by decision makers who are paralyzed. And there is this flow of approval that has to happen in crisis, which you do not have the luxury of time to follow. So that preparedness around not only the tactical response but also communications is so vital, because what happens on the ground and what's communicated has to back each other up to be able to put you in the position where you are a trusted source of information, but you are also have the substance behind that comms.
Terrific, thank you, Elle. I've got a couple of questions, but I'm going to hold them off for now to see whether they also come up from our other speakers. So, Charlie, you've been doing this, as you say, for quite a long time, and your latest book, which is on short business continuity exercises, you look at the role of scenario-based drills as a critical element of building resilience. Can you tell us a bit more, perhaps, about some of the simulated exercise that you feel are particularly relevant to crisis communicators, and then, of course, your overall thoughts on the topic of the day?
Yeah, I kind of take a little bit of a Wimbledon analogy here. As I love a little bit of the tennis, I'm not so good at the cricket, so I couldn't get a cricket analogy in there. So, you know, Wimbledon is on at the moment, and, you know, there's lots of talk at the moment about all the athletes. Djokovic, you know, wants to go for his, I don't know, he wants to go for the record. They're all, there was a bit about Andy Murray this morning, and they're all match fit. So they say they've got a date for Wimbledon, and they will spend a lot of time, there's lots of time and effort from their team, from them getting them match fit. The problem with the crisis is that you can get match fit, yeah, you can do your exercise, you can do your training, but you, unlike Wimbledon, you've no idea when your actually match is going to be. So actually your match could be in 10 years' time, it could be tomorrow. So how do you kind of keep that match fitness? And for me, with senior managers, there's always that balance about how long would they actually spend on business continuity crisis management? How long are they prepared to do? Because they've got lots of other jobs. as well. So what can you reasonably do to make sure your senior managers, but also your crisis comms people are match fit? And exercising is one of those things. And I think we need to do a series of exercises. And I think too often what we do is we have that kind of yearly set piece exercise, and it's a bit of fun and we'll have a jolly time, and we have that one set piece exercise, and that's important, but I think we have to do some other exercising as well. So for the big set piece exercise, I think all of us would agree that our crisis comms people are extremely important. I don't think you can have a sort of communications exercise without crisis comms people. And I think you also have to remember the tactical, strategic and operational, or gold, silver and bronze, whatever you like to call it, that there always is a comms element. You might not get comms professionals at all levels, but there's always a communication element. So you should always place some elements of communications. And I think with the sort of large set piece exercise, this is your really opportunity, as Rod said earlier, to work with the lawyers, to go and work out to say, actually, will they stop you saying anything, or do they want to take 4 hours to conjugate over every single word you say? Or actually, as lawyers, they may be more enlightened and quite relaxed and say, yeah, you can say that. I'm happy with that. There's nothing wrong with that. So you need to work with some of those people who you perhaps don't normally work, and you need to do that storming and forming and that teamwork, so that when you come onto the day, you're not going to have a massive argument with your lawyers. But it's not just your lawyers, it's the people who sign off your anything you need signed off. What is the process? Do the senior managers know they're actually going to sign off? Are they competent? Are they confident? Are they going, oh, I don't know what to do. This is not my job. You sign it off. I don't. And you have procedures there. You've also got the whole internal comms piece, which might, as a crisis professional, may not be your bag. It may be somebody else to do that. So you need to work with that. How are you going to coordinate those internal comms? And then if it's a cyber incident or your regulated business, you've got your compliance regulation people, and you need to make sure you keep to the regulation requirements. So if it's a cyber incident, you've got your 72 hours to say something to the ICO. Do you know that? Do they know that? And you need to make sure. And also within communications, often I find that unless you're a really large organization, quite often you may have different departments who do communications tasks, such as writing of social media. That could be outsourced, that could be insourced. People update the website, people monitoring social media, monitoring the press, preparation for that. So that was some of the things we talked about earlier about preparation for briefing people. You might have a wider team that does that. It might actually not be professionals that do that. You might rope in a few extra people to help you with your team. So you need to work with those people. I think the comms team need to practice themselves. Now, I don't see a huge amount of comms teams, but I don't very often hear about comms teams doing their own exercise. Maybe you're all doing it and I don't know about it, but I wonder perhaps, can I be rude here to say there's maybe a little bit of an arrogance? We do this every single day. We know what we do. And actually, if you're faced by a crisis, it is very different dynamics. It's a very different pressure. And do you really know what you're doing? Have you practiced? And have you practiced writing copy for a particular incident? Have you practiced, especially if that copy might be something quite complex, something quite technical, you need to explain that. Have you practiced developing your media strategy? What media strategy should you use there? Have you practiced working together? And have you practiced the wider teams? Like we've got a media incident simulator, so it's a portal you can log on to, and we play the media and we post it up into this portal, and then in exercises our clients can then post to their website, they can post on social media. Unless you're using something like that, and then we have a person behind it who then posts on your post, unless you get that feedback loop, need to have that, and there are other ones out there, you could just get someone old and wise, or maybe a consultant in there to help you, who says, you've just written that. Have you really thought about that? Do you understand the impact that, well, we didn't think they would see it. Well, the public will see it like this. So I think I really encourage crisis comms people to practice, whether you do it internally or get a consultant in, perhaps doesn't really matter. And I think the other thing, and this is what I put in my book, is trying to keep people match fit. The people coming out to Wimbledon don't do 3 days really intensive training and they do it. They train all the time, and then they train up to the exercise or their match here. So I'm a great believer in short exercises, little and often. If you had your comms team meeting, or even your senior management meetings, and say, take an event of the day and say, let's take half an hour, 45 minutes. How would we deal with that? If we were the Ocean Gate crisis comms team dealing with the squash submarine and the Titanic, how would we deal with it? Could we do better than them? Could we do worse? Would we do the same thing? And if you look at the Bud Light controversy, which anyone who's on crisis comms, I'm sure, has been following, especially because they don't seem to have done it particularly well. How would you dealt with that situation? How would have you done better? Could your comms come better? I do a lot of studying of ransomware response, so things like Arnold Clark and Capita. I've written extensive on those ones as case studies, and say, sometimes if you look at people's crisis comms, you dissect them word by word, you suddenly realize quite how awful they are at it. So, I think there's great opportunity to learn from others' mistakes or other people doing well. So my thoughts is, exercise, get part of the big exercise, as many exercises as you can, practice internally, and conduct shorter. Little and often does help, as well as the main exercise.
Brilliant, Charlie. And I have to giggle that the crisis preparedness model I use is called Match Fit. So thank you for the multiple name checks. I think it's such an important way of thinking about it. I often talk about muscle memory, and I think that the muscle memory through repeated low-level exercise is better than 4 hours in the gym once a month. So I've now broken your metaphor, but thank you for letting me do so anyway. Rena, your podcast, you've been doing this for, I think, about 4 years now. I think both Charlie and I have had the honor of being on, and you've interviewed, literally dozens of experts from across multiple disciplines internationally, from across the whole resilience spectrum. Looking back at those 4 years, what are the sort of key themes that have emerged from those multiple interviews on your podcast?
Yeah, Rod, it's the number one bane of people's life is how to get people to do what they don't want to do, is the common theme that comes up, and Charlie's laughing because we've had so many conversations about this. It's really underpinned by two main concepts that I've seen, is that resilience isn't a solo game, and that means business resilience and personal resilience. And encompassing all of that is that there's this phrase that I like to called resiliency through relationships. So to achieve all of that, you need to put in the effort, the relationship, and maintain that to get people to do what they want, to become resilient as a business and as an individual too. And regardless of whatever subject that we've been discussing on the resilience pod, those core themes are always kind of things that underpin that. And what I've realized from speaking to all these people is we know what we're doing. All these concepts that we've all talked about just now aren't specifically new. It's we don't have the time, and we don't want the time to invest the time to actually make them effective, because we need to get everything done ASAP. And I know we're going to talk about some of this a bit later on, so I won't go too much into it, but essentially it's having that relationship so we can become more resilient within the business and personally too. And I've used that in my day job as well, where I'm trying to get people to do what they don't want to do, working with stakeholders, collaborating, say, with the crisis people, the comms people, business continuity people, and they just don't want to know. And so what I've done is invested time and maintained those relationships, been persistent, and then explained, okay, this is what this means in your language. This is why you, for example, have to do business continuity. What are you so afraid of? How can we incorporate into your objectives, make it relevant to you, and so forth? And that surprisingly is, I know, when I was looking through past all the episodes, I thought it would be something really groundbreaking, but it's not. It's just really simple as what I've just said.
Brilliant, short and sweet, but so insightful. I mean, for me personally, there are two things that jumped out. This thing about, business and personal resilience. I spend my life talking to people about the fact that organizational resilience depends on what I call human preparedness. We obsess with systems, processes, and infrastructure, and forget that it's the human beings that implement those processes that actually are the difference between success and failure. And the focus on relationships. I mean, I think people obsess with reputation, which is what people think, feel, and understand about you. For me, what really matters is the relationships. How do they behave and act as a result of that reputation? So really good thoughts. Just a few questions for the panel based on what you've said. This question of culture that Elle-Marie raised, I mean, I've seen this having had the privilege of working internationally. Culture, both corporate and, if you like, geographic, is absolutely fundamental in my experience. I just love your thoughts, Elle-Marie, perhaps since you work so globally, I know everyone does, any really sort of acute examples of where culture has been got very right or very wrong without saying anything you shouldn't?
There's a few aspects to culture. Firstly is the organizational culture. So we look at companies, for instance, who really invest in their preparedness in crisis response, and that there is this, again, I'm going to use aviation as an example because that's an easy one to use, but you have got a safety culture or a resilience culture and a preparedness culture, and then you've got this, so we want to stop things from happening, and a lot of investment goes into that, particularly in oil and gas industries, aviation, transport industries. So there's a lot of, and of course in technology as well, a lot of investment going into stopping from that happen. And then you get the other side of the culture is people really buying in from the top down to putting this as a priority for the organization, because it takes one crisis to just demolish your reputation and your shares in the market. So there's that. So the organizational culture, peer support, the individual resilience that Rena's talking about, people invest in that and train their teams, that really makes a huge difference. Then there is the culture in who you are responding to. So who has been infected in which country? What do they expect from you? And I'll give you a real homegrown example here. Is I recently responded to the Afghan refugees coming into Heathrow. And I will treat this a little bit like a Chatham House rule, Rod, if I may, because I think there's so many important lessons that we can learn that we don't share enough. But the Afghan refugees arrived at Heathrow, and it was an incredible effort by government, border force, police, the NHS, volunteers like myself, who got together and supported these people as they arrived. So the first flights that arrived, people were clothed, they weren't injured, they were okay, and they, went through the process. But as the flights came in later and later and later, people were really in distress. There was a huge humanitarian need for clothing. Women have waded through sewage and scaled walls with their babies to get onto the relief flights. So they arrived with us in quite a desperate state, and there was a lot of injuries as well. And there was a huge humanitarian effort, and we had clothing and we had stations there for people. But as the women arrived, it was summer here, and we had spaghetti strap tops, for instance, for people. Here's clean clothing, and we've got everything ready for you. But we didn't consider the fact that you are usually wearing a hijab. So the women were would rather stay in these soiled outfits than wear inappropriate clothing, according to their culture. So that was a real quick an oversight that could have made a huge difference to the response that I witnessed there. Also, thinking about communications, that was another part. So we brought in, I'm saying we, but the airport brought in some interpreters. And these interpreters, and this happened often in crisis, is you bring people in on the fly because there's a massive need and you weren't prepared and you didn't really know what was needed because there's so many nuances around a response. But we had interpreters there. They were not trained. They could speak the language. That was the extent of the expertise that they brought. So these people became secondary victims because they were speaking in their language. They were buffering a lot of information that had to come to the responders to take care of the people. So there was one point where a responder, an interpreter, and I stood side by side, and I just leaned against him to sort of go, "Are you okay?" And he broke down and he said, I'm usually working on the technical side of the airport, and here I am listening to my fellow countrymen telling me the most desperate stories, and I have to filter through the detail to tell you he wants, he needs medical support, or so I hear what they've seen and I hear what they've heard of. So there's so many aspects to culture. And bringing in people who can help you bridge the cultural gap also needs to be aware of what they're going to be faced with, also needs the training so that you don't sit with secondary assault. So there's a lot that I can talk to, Rod, but I don't want to take too much time.
It's fascinating, is one of our last session bar one looked at the whole question of caring for teams in a crisis, and we had Darlena Mohammed, who was involved in Malaysia Airlines, and the whole question about cultural and human sensitivity, and also making the scenario planning and simulation process a creative exercise, by which I mean thinking about scenarios that you really need to be creative with, because it's often, in my experience, not the obvious, it's the curveballs that you can actually vaguely think about if you go into the simulation process with a creative hat on. Charlie, you had a thought.
Yeah, I was just going to add up just a sort of slightly different thing on culture was did a reasonable amount of work and exercising in Middle Eastern countries, not name them, and teaching crisis management. You're teaching crisis management in the UK. You say, you live and die by your crisis comms, and you live and die by the media's response and your interested parties' response, and that is really, really key. So go off to actually a number of countries, and you suddenly think there's not really actually a free and fair press here. So actually, maybe there isn't such a crisis comms element to this, because if the government, especially working for large government organizations or even kind of large institutions, the government is not going to allow the press to put out lots of bad press. So do you kind of dial back on the crisis comms? But on the other hand, lots of these countries got the young population and very much into their social media. And so the government can't really control the social media. And so you have to think about actually, understanding the culture in which you're operating and trying to say, actually, my normal model doesn't just lift and shift to the Middle East, because actually, of course, the media may not downplay this incident, but actually the social media may go you get a lot of anger, and it's an outlet there. So I always think that we have to be a little bit careful of when we go outside our own culture and we don't lift and shift our own culture and plonk it on somebody else's, because actually, what is important to them. I'm sure that when you've done sort of crisis responses, here we have very sensitive about bodies. In other cultures, you lay them out on the floor and you pick which one is yours, and that is culturally acceptable, which it wouldn't be acceptable here. So the cultural bit in crisis management is important. You do your homework and understand who you're dealing with and what you're dealing with, and understand the kind of overall facts, but have to adapt them for local culture.
Yeah, and I think you reminded us of a fundamental thing, is that all crisis media is crisis comms, but not all crisis comms is crisis media. I think the obsession with media as the only prism through which reputational relationships are reconfigured is a mistake that's often made. I've got a couple of minutes. I really want to make lots of time for the audience questions, of which there are many. So one other very quick question and some very quick answers, if I may. In getting all of this right, what do you see as the predominant blockers in organizations to working in an integrated way? Is it the CEO? Is it the board? Is it the SLT? What are the blockers and how do you overcome them in no more than 30 seconds each?
I think for me, it is often the commercial pool between where are we going to invest our money, in something that we think will never happen to us, versus there are, there's other parts of the organization that needs those funds more. So I would say it is often to do with where the company wants to invest, and if they consider this to be something important or not. That is often a blocker.
Follow the money. Very good point, Rena.
I would say siloed mindset. We're responsible, you're not. This is my baby, your baby. Big bad thing.
Amen to that. Charlie, blockers?
I think what you have to do is make it really easy and enjoyable for people to do the right thing. If they say, I love coming to your exercises, we always have lots of fun. And, you don't need to do a lot of preparation, just turn up and we'll give you a quality 3 hours, then people will come.
Yeah, and I think it's a weird thing to say. I think the fun element, because ultimately it's all about human relationships and frankly, human bonding within teams. People forget that it's ultimately about human beings. Brilliant. I've got a million more questions. I'm not going to ask any of them because I'm going to hand over to Sarah to start taking some of the many questions in the chat. Sarah.
Thanks, Rod, and thanks to the panel. I'm sure everybody who is listening will agree with me. There's been some absolutely fascinating insights already, and hopefully as we work through the questions, we can pull out some more of that gold dust that I think is going to be really helpful for everybody, including myself. I'm learning tons. That's why I love these events. So what I'm going to do is, there's a few questions in the chat and everybody can keep them coming. I've noted down who was speaking as the question came in, and I think it might be useful just to let the speaker who was speaking at the time take first response. So I kind of get the sense that those questions were prompted by that speaker. So just going to first question. Apologies if I'm mispronouncing names. I'll do my best. Nural Huda asks, for how long would each project last on average? Is the support, as the support could be provided for years? And Elmarie, I think you were speaking at the time that question popped up, and I think you were talking to some quite significant events at that time.
It really depends on what the event is. It could be weeks, it could be months. So if we use, for instance, we are working at the moment at a response in Jersey where there was a gas explosion, and our role there is we did the search and recovery of personal effects. So personal effects, for instance, that is unique in itself because that could carry on for months. So first you've got to work alongside police because it could be a criminal investigation. You then have to gather, decontaminate the personal effects, put them in a catalogue, and then the families have a long time to claim. There could be multiple claims. There's legislation around the world in transport that says you have to keep the personal belongings for a minimum of 24 months. In the US, it's 18 months. In the UAE, it's 24 months. But companies could opt to keep it for 10 years, 20 years, depending on the investigation, depending on the need for the affected people. So that could be, that could carry on for years. And of course, the documentation and the data around that can also be quite significant over the years. When it comes to family assistance, for, let's say there's been fatalities, it is shorter, and you would imagine that that should be years, of course, because that's the intense human element. But again, it is this push-pull between you want to do everything for everyone who has been affected versus you have a commercial organization that needs to continue their business as usual. So what we do in family assistance is, let's say there's been fatalities, we would fly people in and they will be on site for as long as the investigation on site continues. That could be 2 weeks, it could be 4 weeks. And then we will provide mental health support and practical support on site. The organization may then decide we want to give each family another 3 or 4 or 6 sessions of therapy after this, but then there has to be a point where they then integrate back into their own home communities, and we hand them over to mental health support in their own home communities. And there's a reason for that, not only a commercial reason, of course, which is always hard to think about in this scenario, but there's also the side of people recover faster and they do better over the long term if you are not their crutch as an organization. You are not there to provide them with their mental health support. You are there to help them cope with what is in front of them, to not make it worse. You can never make it easier, but you cannot make it worse. So we provide them the support. The very nature of crisis should be short-term. It's short-term intervention. That long-term support they have to get from their own home communities. And of course, when it comes to communication, so we activate our contact center. In the first few days of the incident, that could be 3 days of intense calls and emails coming in from affected people, inquiring where their loved one is, or if it's been a data breach, what data has been breached, what can I do? So that can be really intense very quickly, and then it tapers off once you've established contact with all the necessary individuals, and then it becomes a point of contact. But comms it spikes initially and then it tapers off again, and whenever there's an investigation or a report that comes out or a change in what service you provide, it spikes again. So it could be a few days. In cyclones, we have had our contact center open for 3 days, 24/7, to do health checks and for families and well-being checks, and then it closes down, or it could be years. So it's a little bit of how long is a piece of string.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. That's great. Does Rena or Charlie or Rod, do you have anything that you thought would be useful to contribute at this point? Okay, that was really helpful, Anne-Marie. Thank you. So next question is from Kate Betts, and Charlie, I think you were speaking at the time that Kate Betts posted this question, and it's got lots of thumbs up, so lots of people keen to know your thoughts on this. Kate asks, where should comms personnel sit in the gold, silver, bronze setup? And how can comms people be listened to like lawyers are, rather than just used as a comms channel? Very good question.
That is a very good question. A little bit. Naturally, your comms people should be in your crisis management team, your strategical goal. That's normally where you would have them. And you have your goal, your crisis team looking outwards to the rest of the world, and then your tactical team looking inwards to the organization and managing the response and recovery. Sometimes you end up with, if your goal is very strategic, very strategic, and they really want to set the policy, they want to take an overview, they don't want to be kind of dealing with the kind of almost day-to-day operations of the incident. Sometimes you can have your comms people in your tactical team, but on the whole, so the textbook is a little bit, they should be in your crisis management teams. I think it is a fool who doesn't listen to their comms people. Comms is going to, as I said earlier, is going to make or break this incident. So if you don't listen to your comms people, no, It can be about the character of the comms people, it's about how they're seen in the organisation, how serious they taking their skill level. You know, maybe you're an organisation that does very little external comms, you do a bit of internal comms, and that's all you do. So it may be more difficult to be taken seriously in that bit. But I think if you're a comms person, you understand the nature of your business, you can understand the type of incidents you could do. You need to make sure you are trained and exercised and credible to do that job. If that's perhaps not you and you're brilliant at writing stuff in company magazine and that's your main role, then you need to suggest to people maybe you need an external PR company, or you need a company like Elmarie's that can come in and help with crisis comms. But you want a company that can get people in there and say, look, this is just not about, I'm not very good at this, or I'm not really sure what I'm doing. I'm quite happy writing the company magazine. Get those companies in to help you, and it does also help with the old groupthink as well. If you get some external people to come in and help you, advise you, notice advise, not tell you how to do it, but it does help with the groupthink of, you may see your company in a certain way or organization in a certain way, and you don't really realize how other people see you or the effect your comms are having outside. So strategic, get your comms in strategic, and evaluate your skill level. And if you haven't got that skill level, either get training or get a PR company or get both.
Thank you, Charlie.
Can I chuck in a very quick thought from the chair, if that's okay? I think the answer to the question is it depends slightly on where you as comms allow the business to put you, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Is if you allow the business to think about crisis as a one-off moment in time that you prepare for, that's very different from talking the language of risk, which is an ongoing process. And the more you think about crisis through the lens of ongoing risk, the more you remember that the true definition of the word, and I bang on about this continually, is a turning point is not an end point. It has opportunity as well as risk. Then you start to put the comms function more into ongoing strategy and risk conversations, as opposed to, if a factory blows up, what press release do we put out? So I think language is absolutely fundamental, and we far too often allow ourselves to be pigeonholed into crisis as event, as opposed to risk as process.
Yeah, I think those are good points, Rod. I think also, just to mention, Charlie, you also mentioned the value of bringing in an external organisation, specialists, if your company simply doesn't, for whatever reason, have the expertise or capacity to operate in a serious crisis. And I'd kind of add to that from my own experience as well. Organisations that are very hierarchical often benefit from external support, because what that does is it can break up that very narrow focused understanding of where each person is allowed to make a contribution within that organisation. And as an external, I can bring forward somebody who I know has got valuable insights, who in the normal course of events wouldn't be listened to within that hierarchical structure. So I think there's absolutely huge value in getting that external support in order to bring out the best of your organisation in order to respond to a crisis most effectively. My 10 penneth. But unless anybody else wants to add anything else, we've got quite a few questions to work our way through. So a related question, actually, Charlie, you were still speaking when this one popped in too. So Nur Al Huda also comments, should a PR professional be responsible for crisis management within the organisation? I feel like we did cover that off in the previous one, so unless anybody particularly wants to add.
Can I just put the crisis comms person should never be responsible. It should be the head of the crisis team that's responsible. They support, they guide, they do, but they're not responsible.
Okay. And then let's see, Kath Middleditch, she asked a question. And I think it was yourself, Rena, who's talking at the time that Kath popped her question in. Oh yes, and you did start to comment to her, but if you could share some more thoughts on this point. Is there any value in pre-preparing statements and comments in anticipation of crisis scenarios, or do they go out of the window when something actually happens, as the likelihood it isn't something you would plan on paper? As we all know, crisis takes all shapes and forms and becomes unique in its own right each time. Rena, do you want to talk to that? You just popped a reply in there, but
I did, yes. My initial thoughts were yes. It's a bit twofold, really. It's yes and no. You can't prepare for every single scenario, and what I like to call is having a statement or a draft that is scenario agnostic is a good starter for 10. And so when something is going on like a crisis, you're not kind of scrambling around in your head thinking, oh no, shoot, what do I write? What do I write? How should it be set out? You've got the templates there. You can quickly adjust to them and then tweak them according to what's going on. And I've personally found that's really helpful. And Charlie's putting his hand up, so I'll let him tweak in there. It's probably going to contradict what I say.
Okay, Charlie, you.
I think that's totally right, but the majority of statements I see in advance are waste of time and not. The problem is I see statements, lots of people write these phrases and they're just being lazy. What they write is to say, today we had on the 27th, and there were blank casualties. Well, you can write that in 2 seconds. So the majority of the pre-prepared statements I see people are an utter waste of time, and you could write them in 2 seconds. Where I think you really need to be doing it is where it requires some thought to write them. And I think this is sometimes a little bit more about technical things. So you have a ransomware attack and you're absolutely locked out. You might want to put out on your statement, what preparation have you done? What, how much money have you spent? What is your background in cyber? So you can say, look, we spent tons and tons of money here. We had gold standard, absolutely ISO 27001. That requires thought, speaking to the IT people and putting together, because that takes time. That to me is worth writing. Maybe you've got, you operate a whole load of different helicopters. So what is the training record of the B-27 Puma 37/6? What is the accident record of that? You operate 3 of those, so let's do that. So I think you have to write pre-prepared statements on things which take time and research, not this kind of, we have 3 blank casualties, which is to me an utter waste of time.
Yeah, and having those prompts as a template is also helpful. So yeah, it's not written there, but you need to have that almost like a checklist, maybe would probably be better than a statement, which prompts you, and then you can just tick off or cross out what's needed and what isn't, because again, time is of essence, right? And you're not going to necessarily think of these things going forward.
Elle-Marie, you had something you want to add?
Yeah, I just want to add to that a little bit. I want to contradict Charlie ever so slightly, if you'd forgive me, Charlie. The advice that we give our clients is to have those basic things ready. And I'll tell you why I say that. Of course, Charlie's point is that there's complex things that you could spend more time on is important. But I think it depends on the organization as well, because we now, I always say you have to be ready with a statement as quickly as it takes people to click, like, and share. And those statements can be very, very basic, like we can confirm that blank. Those things can be ready because in a time of crisis, people have their hair is on fire at that time. And to give them that start to go, this is pre-approved, you can issue this, it just buys you a bit of time to say, we are aware that our concern lies with, we are cooperating with, whatever those messages can be, they can be almost tailored to most incidents. It's just to say that we are aware that something has happened. We have dropped everything we're doing to dedicate resources to paying attention to this incident. Those things can be really easily done beforehand, which will buy you time. And they are important because you may be expected within 15 minutes to issue a tweet that you are aware that something's happened. And if an organization, like Sarah said earlier, has got this layered approach to what can we issue and who needs to approve it, if those things are not done beforehand, you are on the back foot automatically. So I would say that those basic statements, if they are a no-brainer, get them done. And then at the time of the incidents, because there's so many nuances around that and so many different variables when it comes to an incident, that you can spend your resources in writing the more complex things that Charlie has said. The more you can prepare beforehand, the better for you at the time. And it may well mean that none of that gets used because it doesn't apply to the incident. But I think to have those ready is vital.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. Rena.
I think just from listening to everyone, it goes to show that some of these questions are not so black and white, and it's really imperative. And there's a lot of other questions going down the chat, which probably have the same kind of framework. It depends on the landscape of your business that you're operating in, because if you're 3-people team or a small team, it's going to be very different to 5,000 people, 20,000 people, and the hierarchy. So you have to first understand what the resilience landscape looks like within your business and where the parameters are before then deciding, okay, who's got responsibility and accountability where, who's got the lines into where, what can we do, what's the time, what is of essence in the time frames, and what needs approval and so forth. So it's not black and white, I'm afraid. You have to go back and do the work in your business and find out what the appetite is for that too.
Can I just, I know we're belaboring this point, but it's such an important one. I'm going to join Anne-Marie in gently chiding Charlie on that point about them being useless. When I was working on MH370, when the scenarios themselves, the imagination of what could have happened, were evolving in real time. At any given time, we were running about 15 different potential scenarios. And the fact of at least having those mental parameters in place, which means that when CNN phones up and says, would you like to put someone up for a panel on whether the plane has been taken by a UFO? No, piss off. Of course we wouldn't. What a ridiculous question. At least you know what your parameters are. So I'm with you, Charlie, in that thinking you can foresee everything is crazy. But in my experience, the blank piece of paper when legal is shouting at you is way worse than at least having something with blanks that you can fill in.
Thanks. We're gloriously running out of time as ever, because once we get going, there's a zillion questions. I'm just going to dot around a tiny bit because there's one with a different sort of feel to it entirely, and it's from Tal Donahue. And Tal asks, on blockers, what are the panel's thoughts on cognitive bias, usually in leadership teams? Issues such as Nelmesy bias can significantly impact a brand's approach to and appetite to invest in crisis preparedness. I thought that was a cracker. Anybody want to talk about bias? Charlie?
Yeah, I think in bias, I think the first thing is to do is recognize that it happens. And I think is when you get a sophisticated crisis management team, maybe done lots of exercise, maybe worked together, maybe done some real life crises together, you can start to get a level of sophistication where you actually recognize there's some biases. And this is why I think you need some external people to come in, whether that's external to your organization, whether that's or someone internally to run past ideas, to just say, actually, we've got this plan. I'm going to get a couple of old wise heads into the organization and just run it past them. I think it is, if you recognize that these things are, then you can start to do something about it. And I think a sophisticated team will get in other people outside the team to avoid that kind of groupthink, those biases, and then they can make sure that, say, actually, what's the one where the sunk, there's one they say you have this idea and you sunk yourself an idea and you keep following it long after that idea is dead. sink fallacy. So, you know, just someone said, no, we tried that for long enough, it's still not working, we need to cut it, we need to do something else. So I think it's recognizing it, but maybe have someone who can help you recognize it.
Thanks. We're actually running short of time, Rod. So can I just bring you in and then wrap up on the questions?
Absolutely. And just on the biases thing, I'm going to put in the chat. There's a crisis outfit called Riv Referer, led by George Hutchinson ex Teneo. And they, as part of their launch, did a specific piece of research on leadership biases in crisis situations. I've put the website and the name of the publication in the chat, and it was absolutely fascinating. That I can't remember which number one was essentially, I think, hero bias. Is don't worry, I'm a leader, I've got this. But there's a whole load of qual and quant research about leadership biases that's really, really important and really interesting. We've run over time again, which is testament to the fact that, as always, we have an interesting topic, but above all else, we have a terrific panel with, frankly, far too many insights to shoehorn into an hour. I just want to thank, traditionally, everybody on the panel for your brilliant insights. Thank you as well to everyone for joining. It's been a really well-attended session with some terrific questions. We'll be, I think, with Anne-Marie's permission, we can double check this. We tend to record and share the recordings. I don't think there was anything too incendiary, but we can talk about that.
It's no problem.
Brilliant. We'll be sharing the recording. Catherine Sykes, one of the co-chairs, will be writing this up as a blog. And just as an advert, coming up in the remainder of the year, we have an event at some point in September on insider risk. And then we have something coming up towards the end of the year on the role of toxic culture in reputation risk and crisis. So lots of great things coming up. This has been amongst the set of very good events this year, one of the very best. So thank you to the panel. Sarah, thank you for co-chairing. Thank you to everyone for joining. And keep an eye on the blogs, the recording, and our events for the rest of the year. So enjoy the rest of your Tuesday. See you very soon.
Thank you, Rod. Thanks, Sarah.
Thanks.
Nice to see you, Charlie, Rena.
Very nice to see you.